Thanks for joining me. This lab session is entitled Run JMeter Baseline Test Lab. This lab is not intended to directly demonstrate good practice regarding the management elements I just completed talking about. The intent in this lab is to inform you about a good practice item important to performance analysis. The next module will dive into that subject, so let us prepare with thoughts on baseline testing. It is good practice to run at least one round of tests that provide you with performance data results, such as response times reflecting low volume activity. In other words, you should obtain some test results that demonstrate how much time it takes for application functions to complete when the environment is operating under non-stressful conditions. This way, you have comparative information to use against medium and high user volume traffic. Before we start with the lab, I want to introduce a report that displays some results of a recent baseline test I want to use as an example. Here is the WebTours performance test script again. I am showing a summary report that presents an attempt to obtain response time data for the common functions in the application. The normal approach is to run only one iteration of each function to document the lowest response time information. Sometimes you may discover a function that seems out of line with what is expected. This presents an opportunity to follow up and analyze what is the cause before proceeding with other tests. Sometimes you may want to allow multiple iterations to run for a given function like the login function, but you try to keep it to low number of iterations, so the minimum response time value is usable for baseline. The login and register functions seem to have a reasonable minimum response time value that is usable. Otherwise, you may need to run more rounds of tests to achieve baseline data for all necessary application functions. Remember, the objective is to run single iterations of functions or minimal iteration counts. And keep in mind that some functions may be impacted by external activities in the system. For example, other services running on the same servers in use by the application, such as backup services, file services, or database services. You may need to run tests for each of the possible external service conditions or combination. To set up for a baseline test, let me walk through what I went through, and maybe we will run another cycle of tests. Let's see how we did that. First of all, what I did was I actually created a copy of the original WebTours performance test script. It has a lot of information in it. I wanted to make some changes. I didn't want to lose what I originally had. So, one of the objectives is, as I said, is to turn some of these tests into single user tests. All right, if we look at these thread groups first, we find out, okay, which of the thread groups do we want to run? Well, I wanted information on the login, logout, register, flight pay, flight change, flight inquiry. Don't need it for the utilities, so those are grayed out as you can see. And we need it for the itinerary, the single cancellation, and the full cancellation thread. So, what do? We then go to the thread groups that we're going to use, and we look at the thread group element. And in this case, it's that ultimate thread group, not as easy to cut it down to 1. What I did was I just changed this first value to a 1 so that the number of threads is now just 1, which would start with 1 user. However, we have this hold whatever is out there until a minute. I didn't change that. I could change that, cut it down to maybe 1, 2, 3 seconds. That would be enough to keep it at a minimum number of iterations, because what it tries to do in this particular thread group is to keep the number you have at the thread count always running, and so that it could take a number of more than what you would expect. So you want to control that with this number, but that still might not be enough. We'll look at that result again. Now, the next one is also one of the unusual thread groups, and we've got the same situation. We want to start with 1 user, but it's going to iterate multiple times and get more users because of this number. And again, we can change that number. I didn't on my first run. Now, with the rest of these thread groups, they're using the normal original thread group, and it's simple enough to say, I don't want more than 1 loop, and that will translate into a single user. Now, sometimes that's not the case, because sometimes we can use the number of threads as the number of users. And then this loop count then says for every user, we want to run so many iterations. But the way that the script is designed, the loop count represents the number of users. But keep in mind, you could have tests where the thread count represents the number of users. And in that event, you're using this number and this number to control how many users are going to process or how many iterations are going to process. Hopefully you understood that. And each of the others, the same. We have 1 down here, 1, 1. So those should get exactly 1 user to execute. And when you saw my original display, it showed 1 for all of those with the exception of the login and register. So let's do something on that. Let's go back to the login and say, all right, let's change that value to 3. That should be sufficient. And on this one, let's change that also to 3. All right, so we have the login, logout at 3 and the register at 3. Let's run this test. Okay, the test completed. Let's take a look at the summary report again. And this time we see some numbers that are a little different. We see less login count. It's down to just 7. And so that includes mainly these 6 plus that login. So that worked out nicely. And we see the register, instead of 95, we're down to about 19. That's a reasonable amount. And the minimum, it looks like it's at a good number to consider as a baseline. Same thing with the login. However, notice that if you remember, you don't have to, but some of these, like the flight pay and change and inquiry, is a little bit longer. It was less before for the minimum. And that's the kind of thing that you need to be aware of and noticing. Make sure that what you see is not telling you that maybe there's some external processes going on. In my case, it would be on my machine that's running that I wasn't expecting it to run. So in that case, it might be worthwhile to run 3 or 4 times and then look at the results of each and decide on what seems to be the best. But still, we have to take into consideration those times when some other external processes could be impacting the actual response time, and we have to do something about it. In some cases, we've had to recommend to whoever was responsible to run backups and file services at a different time of the day when it would impact that application the least. So those are things to consider when you start thinking about analysis and the impact of testing beyond low volume traffic. One other thing I wanted to point out that I didn't at the beginning, when you do a baseline test, if you will, see this checkbox for the run thread groups consecutively? That's a good idea too. If you have several threads, then you want them to run separately so they don't impact each other and cause the response times to be out of kilter with what would be considered baseline response time. My time has ended for this session. I thank you for yours. Join me in the next video.